Alistair Sterling existed in a world of polished glass and muted steel, a kingdom 80 floors above the ceaseless grind of the city. Rain, a constant companion that autumn, streaked down the panoramic windows of his penthouse, blurring the lights below into a watercolor wash of melancholy. The silence in the cavernous apartment was his own creation, a carefully curated emptiness that echoed the hollow space inside his chest. He was the CEO of a company his father had built from bedrock and grit, a legacy now resting on his shoulders like a shroud woven from stock prices and board expectations. The pressure had become a physical thing, a tightness in his jaw, a cold knot in his stomach. His security chief, a grim-faced man named Arthur whose loyalty was a relic of his father's era, had delivered the latest piece of paranoia that morning. He spoke of whispers, of petty theft among the domestic staff in buildings like this one, a symptom of the city's growing desperation. Arthur had suggested enhanced background checks, surveillance, a show of force. Alistair, however, felt a different, more cynical impulse take root. He believed people were fundamentally transactional, their kindness a currency spent only when a return was expected. He had seen it in boardrooms, in lavish charity galas, in the saccharine smiles of women who looked at his wallet before they looked at his eyes. He wanted proof, a validation of his bleak worldview. He wanted to see the gears of self-interest turn with his own eyes. The new cleaning woman was starting today. Her name was Alara, a simple name for what he assumed was a simple person with simple needs and, likely, simple morals. The plan formed in his mind with a cold, detached clarity. It was a cruel little experiment, a game only he would be playing. He would leave a lure, something of immense value, in plain sight. He would feign sleep, a moment of manufactured vulnerability, and he would watch. He walked over to the velvet-lined box on his dresser and picked up the Patek Philippe his father had given him, its platinum case heavy and cold in his hand. It was worth more than most people made in a decade. He placed it on the polished mahogany of the side table next to the chaise lounge in his study, the room she was scheduled to clean last. He then loosened his tie, kicked off his expensive leather shoes, and lay down, draping a cashmere throw over himself. He closed his eyes, slowed his breathing, and waited, the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall counting down the seconds to his inevitable disappointment. He heard the quiet click of the study door opening, followed by the soft, almost apologetic shuffle of her footsteps. He smelled the faint, clean scent of rain on her coat, and something else, something warm and simple, like fresh bread. He kept his breathing even, a mask of slumber fixed on his face. Through the sliver of his barely open eyelids, he watched her move. Alara was not what he had expected. She was slight, with a quiet grace to her movements that seemed out of place. There was a weariness in the set of her shoulders, but a resolve in the way she carried herself. She began her work with a focused, silent efficiency, dusting shelves, wiping surfaces, her presence a mere whisper in the vast, imposing room. Then, she approached the side table. Alistair's heart, against his will, gave a small, traitorous thump. This was the moment. He watched her pause, her gaze falling upon the watch. She stopped moving entirely, a small statue in the dim lamplight. He saw her look at the gleaming timepiece, then at his feigned sleeping form. He braced himself for the quick, furtive movement, the slip of the watch into a pocket, the confirmation of his world-weary beliefs. But it never came. Instead, she did something that shattered his carefully constructed cynicism into 1,000 pieces. She picked up a leather coaster from a stack on the table, gently lifted the priceless watch, and slid the coaster underneath it, protecting the polished wood from being scratched. A small, almost invisible act of consideration. Alistair's mind reeled. It made no sense. It was an act devoid of personal gain, a gesture of care for an inanimate object belonging to a man she did not know. He was still processing this when she moved again. She noticed the cashmere throw had slipped from his shoulder, exposing him to the cool draft seeping in from the window. She hesitated for only a second before stepping closer. He could feel the warmth of her presence, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of the room. With a tenderness that felt utterly foreign to him, she gently took the edge of the blanket and drew it up, tucking it securely around his shoulder. Her fingers brushed his shirt for a fleeting instant, a touch so light it was like the whisper of a feather, yet it sent a jolt through his entire body. He lay there, perfectly still, his mind a maelstrom of confusion. He had expected greed, and he had received care. He had set a trap for a thief and had instead caught a glimpse of a quiet, unassuming goodness he no longer believed existed. She finished her work in silence and left as quietly as she had come, closing the door with a soft click that echoed the sound of a lock turning somewhere deep inside of him. Alistair did not move for a long time. The weight of the blanket on his shoulder felt heavier than any corporate burden he had ever carried. It was a weight of kindness, freely given, and it pinned him to the chaise lounge with the force of a revelation. His cruel little test had failed spectacularly. Or perhaps it had succeeded in a way he had never intended, by proving not how corrupt the world was, but how wrong he had been about it. The next day, Alistair could not get the image of Alara's quiet gesture out of his head. It played on a loop, a stark contrast to the aggressive posturing and veiled threats of his morning board meeting. He sat in his office, the city spread out beneath him like a map of his own conquests. Yet all he could think about was the woman who cleaned his floors. He buzzed his assistant. "Get me Arthur on the line." When the security chief answered, his voice was as gravelly as ever. "Sir." "Arthur," Alistair began, choosing his words carefully. "I need you to find out about the new cleaning woman." "Alara," he paused. "I want to know everything. But be discreet. Utterly discreet. This is not an investigation. It is the personnel review." Arthur, ever the professional, asked no questions. "It will be done, Mr. Sterling." While he waited, Alistair found himself observing. He started leaving his study door ajar when she was due to arrive. He watched her work, her movements economical and graceful. There was no wasted energy, no resentment in her posture. She simply did what needed to be done with a quiet dignity that he found both baffling and compelling. A few days later, a slim, unmarked folder appeared on his desk. Alistair waited until the end of the day, after the last of his executives had departed, to open it. The city lights had begun to flicker on, painting his office in hues of gold and silver. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep within him. The report was concise, just the facts, but the facts told a story of profound tragedy and resilience. Alara Jensen, 32 years old, a widow. Her husband, a man named David, had been a construction foreman. He had died 2 years prior in a scaffolding collapse at a downtown high-rise project. The project, Alistair noted with a sickening lurch in his stomach, was owned by a rival firm, a company infamous for cutting corners on safety regulations to pad their profit margins. The report continued. Alara had been a registered nurse, working in an emergency room. After her husband's death and the ensuing legal battles that drained their savings, she had been forced to leave her demanding hospital job to find work with more flexible hours to care for their son. She now worked 2 jobs, cleaning his penthouse in the afternoons and a commercial office building overnight. All for him. Their son, Leo, was 6 years old. Alistair leaned back in his chair, the whiskey forgotten. The information recontextualized everything. Her weariness was not just fatigue. It was the bone-deep exhaustion of a single mother fighting to stay afloat. Her quiet strength was not a personality trait. It was a necessity forged in loss. He thought of her pulling the blanket over his shoulder, a simple, nurturing act. She had been a nurse. Care was her instinct. A wave of shame washed over him, so potent it made him feel dizzy. He had judged her, had set a petty trap to confirm his own biases, while she was living a life of quiet heroism he could barely comprehend. His world of hostile takeovers and market fluctuations seemed pathetic and trivial compared to her daily struggle for survival and dignity. The next afternoon, he found himself engineering a reason to speak with her. He was in the kitchen, pretending to struggle with a new, overly complicated espresso machine, when she came in to empty the trash. "I can't seem to get this blasted thing to work," he said, his voice sounding unnatural and loud in the quiet space. She didn't say a word, simply came over, her expression unreadable. She looked at the machine, then at the instructions he had deliberately crumpled beside it. She pressed a sequence of buttons with a practiced ease. The machine whirred to life, gurgling as it began to brew. "You have to prime the pump first," she said softly, her voice the first he had ever heard it above a whisper. It was a low, melodic sound. She looked at him, her eyes, a deep, clear gray, meeting his for a moment. There was no judgment in them, only a calm observation. "Thank you," he managed to say, feeling like a fool. "You're welcome, Mr. Sterling," she replied, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to her work. The interaction was brief, insignificant by any normal measure, but for Alistair, it was a landmark. He had wanted to connect, to somehow apologize without words for his silent, ugly suspicions. He wasn't sure he had succeeded, but it was a start. A week later, a crisis with her childcare forced Alara to bring her son, Leo, with her to the penthouse. She approached Alistair with a deep-seated anxiety in her eyes, her apology profuse and sincere. "He will be no trouble, Mr. Sterling, I promise. He has his drawing pad. He will sit quietly in the kitchen." Alistair, to his own surprise, found himself waving away her concerns. "It's fine. The apartment is big enough. Don't worry about it." He retreated to his study, but once again left the door ajar. He watched Leo, a small, serious boy with his mother's gray eyes, sit at the large kitchen island. The boy didn't make a sound, utterly absorbed in his drawing, his crayons gliding across the paper. Alara worked with her usual efficiency, but her eyes kept darting towards her son, a silent, constant check-in. Later, as she was finishing up in his study, Alistair walked out to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Leo was gone, but a piece of paper was left on the counter, weighted down by a salt shaker. Alistair picked it up. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bold strokes of wax crayon. It depicted a tall, dark tower, unmistakably his building. Inside the highest window was a stick figure with a crown drawn crookedly on its head and a sad, downturned mouth. But next to the sad king, in the corner of the page, Leo had drawn a huge, brilliant yellow sun, its rays reaching toward the tower. Alistair stared at the drawing, a strange tightness forming in his throat. He felt seen, truly seen, in a way that no corporate profiler or magazine article had ever managed. A 6-year-old boy had looked at his gilded cage and seen the prisoner inside. When Alara came to collect her son, Alistair was still holding the drawing. He showed it to Leo. "I like this very much," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "But why is the king so sad?" Leo looked up at him, his expression serious and profound. "Because he's all alone," the boy said simply. He then pointed to the crayon sun. "So I gave him some sunshine. So he won't be." The innocent, devastatingly accurate observation struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. He looked from the boy's earnest face to his mother's, and saw in her eyes a flicker of understanding, a shared moment of recognition that went far beyond their roles as employer and employee. In that moment, the sterile penthouse felt a little less empty, the silence a little less profound. The sunshine, it seemed, was already starting to work. The drawing found a permanent home, not framed on a wall, but tucked into the inside pocket of the suit jacket Alistair wore most often. It became a talisman, a private reminder of the simple, unvarnished truth a child had shown him. His interactions with Alara, though still brief and professional, began to change. He would make a point of being in the kitchen when she and Leo arrived, offering the boy a glass of juice, asking him what he was drawing that day. He learned to read the subtle shifts in Alara's demeanor. A slight downturn of her lips meant she was worried about a bill. A shadow in her eyes meant Leo had a cough she couldn't afford to take a day off for. He started leaving a small cash bonus on the counter every Friday, tucked into an envelope marked simply for a job well done. She never acknowledged it directly, but on the following Mondays, the shadow in her eyes would be a little lighter. One afternoon, he found her staring at a wilting orchid on his windowsill, her expression one of gentle pity for the dying plant. "It needs more light, but not direct sun," she said, more to herself than to him. "And it's drowning. The roots need to breathe." The next day, he moved the orchid. He followed her unspoken instructions, and within a few weeks, a new, vibrant green shoot had appeared. It felt like a small, shared victory. These quiet moments became the foundation of a fragile, unspoken connection. They were building something, not with words, but with small acts of tea and rescued plants and crayon drawings. This delicate new ecosystem was violently disrupted by a man named Marcus Thorne. Marcus was Alistair's second-in-command, a man whose ambition was as sharp and polished as his Italian suits. He was everything Alistair used to be: ruthless, charming, and utterly devoted to the bottom line. It was Marcus who was spearheading the company's new flagship project, a massive residential development on the city's waterfront. The anonymous email arrived late on a Tuesday night. It was a single sentence. Check the safety inspection reports for the North Shore project. The concrete is bad. It was signed a friend. Alistair felt a familiar cold dread creep up his spine. He spent the entire night in a secure data room, personally pulling the project files. What he found made him physically ill. Marcus had been systematically falsifying reports, colluding with a subcontractor to use substandard building materials, and bribing inspectors to look the other way. He was cutting corners to a criminal degree, all to bring the project in under budget and trigger a massive bonus for himself and his team. The parallels to what had happened to Alara's husband were chilling and undeniable. It was the same story of greed and negligence, playing out under his own roof. The company, his father's legacy, was now responsible for the very sin that had shattered Alara's life. The moment of choice arrived 2 days later, at an emergency board meeting Marcus himself had called. He stood before the board, a picture of confidence, presenting the spectacular, fraudulent profit margins of the North Shore project. The board members, old men who smelled of money and complacency, were ecstatic. They lauded Marcus, clapping him on the back. Alistair sat at the head of the table, the damning evidence in a folder in front of him. He had two paths. He could stay silent, let Marcus become the company's new hero, and allow the profits to roll in. Doing so would protect the stock price, protect his father's name, and protect his own position. But it would make him complicit. It would mean a building full of families would be living in a death trap. Or he could speak. He could expose Marcus, which would detonate a bomb in the center of the company. The stock would collapse. Lawsuits would bury them. The media would have a field day. His career, his reputation, and the legacy he had worked so hard to maintain would be incinerated. It would be corporate suicide. His mind was a battlefield. The old Alistair, the cynical pragmatist, screamed at him to protect the company. But a new voice, quieter and steadier, spoke of integrity. It spoke of a woman who put a coaster under a watch and a boy who drew a son for a sad king. What was the value of a legacy built on a foundation of lies? He returned to the penthouse that evening a ghost, the decision warring within him. He stood by the window, staring at the city but seeing nothing. He was so lost in his turmoil that he didn't hear Alara enter the study. "Mr. Sterling?" He turned, startled. She stood in the doorway, a tray in her hands. On it was a single cup of tea, steam rising from it in a fragile ribbon. She had seen the exhaustion etched on his face, the despair in his posture, and had responded with the only tool she had, a simple act of care. She set the tray down on the table beside him. She did not ask him what was wrong. She did not pry or offer platitudes. She simply looked at him with her clear, steady gray eyes, and in them, he saw an unwavering belief in something he was no longer sure he possessed. "Whatever it is," she said, her voice soft but firm, a quiet anchor in his storm. "You will do the right thing. I know you will." Her words, so simple, so certain, cut through his panic. She wasn't telling him what to do. She was telling him who he was. She saw a man of integrity, even when he couldn't see it in himself. Her faith in him was a gift, more valuable than any stock option or profit margin. In that instant, the war inside him ended. The choice was no longer difficult. It was the only choice he could possibly make. He picked up the teacup, its warmth seeping into his cold hands. He looked at her, a silent gratitude passing between them that was more profound than any spoken words. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Alistair Sterling walked into his own boardroom and set a torch to his life's work. He didn't shout or make accusations. In a calm, measured voice, he laid out Marcus Thorne's fraud, presenting the falsified documents and the independent engineering report he had commissioned overnight. He detailed the criminal negligence, the lives put at risk, the rot at the core of their celebrated project. The room fell into a stunned, horrified silence. Marcus's face went from crimson rage to ashen fear. The board members, who had been celebrating their windfall just days before, now looked at him as if he had brought a serpent into their Eden. Then, Alistair did the one thing none of them expected. "The failure of oversight that allowed this to happen is mine and mine alone," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. As such, I am tendering my resignation as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. He didn't stop there. Furthermore, I will be liquidating 25% of my personal holdings in this company. The funds will be used to establish a trust dedicated to rectifying the construction flaws in the North Shore project and to compensate any workers who were put at risk. The remainder will seed a new foundation to advocate for stricter workplace safety regulations. He stood up, placed his key card on the polished table, and walked out of the room without a backward glance. He didn't hear the explosion of panicked shouting that erupted behind him. He just kept walking, feeling the immense weight of his father's legacy finally lift from his shoulders. He felt ruined, but for the first time in years, he also felt free. He returned to the penthouse not as its king, but as a trespasser counting down his final hours. The news was already breaking, his face plastered across every financial news network. He expected to feel regret, fear, a profound sense of loss. Instead, he felt a strange, quiet peace. Alara was there, finishing her work for the day. She moved with her usual quiet purpose, the rhythms of her tasks a steadying presence in the chaos of his unraveling world. She said nothing about the news that was surely buzzing on her phone, nothing about the cataclysm he had unleashed. He found himself speaking, the words tumbling out in a raw, unfiltered confession. He told her everything, not just about Marcus, but about a decision he had made years ago, early in his career. A time when he had prioritized a deadline over a safety concern and a young worker had been badly injured. He had paid for the best medical care, set up a trust for the man's family, but he had never been able to shed the guilt. I became the thing I hated, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I built my walls so high I couldn't see the people on the ground anymore. Alara listened, her expression one of deep, empathetic stillness. When he was finished, the silence stretched between them, filled not with judgment, but with a profound understanding. She then told him about David, her husband. She spoke of his laugh, of his hands that were always calloused but gentle, of the way he could fix anything. She spoke of the phone call that had cleaved her life in two, and the lonely, exhausting years that followed. They were just two people in a quiet room, sharing their scars. His were of guilt, hers were of grief. But in that shared vulnerability, something new was forged. The chasm between the billionaire and the cleaning woman vanished, replaced by the common ground of human frailty and the shared hope for redemption. You didn't just expose a crime, Alistair, she said, using his first name for the very first time. You honored the memory of men like my husband. You gave their loss a meaning. You did the right thing. Tears welled in his eyes, hot and sharp. They were not tears of self-pity, but of catharsis. He had lost an empire, but he had found his own soul. And in the quiet, unwavering gaze of the woman before him, he realized he was no longer alone in his tall, sad tower. A year passed. The world that had once revolved around Alistair Sterling moved on, as it always does. The corporate scandal faded into last year's news, replaced by new dramas and new villains. But in the quiet corners of the city, the seeds Alistair had sown were beginning to grow. The Sterling Foundation for Worker Safety was not a grand, imposing entity. It operated out of a modest, ground-floor office in a neighborhood of brick-faced walk-ups and community gardens. There were no panoramic views, only a window that looked out onto a street where children played. Alistair's new uniform was not a $1,000 suit, but a simple sweater and worn-in jeans. He was not a CEO anymore. He was a founder, an advocate, a man who spent his days meeting with unions, lobbying for legislative change, and reviewing grant applications from families shattered by industrial accidents. His work was no longer about accumulating wealth, but about distributing it in a way that mattered. The sterile penthouse was a distant memory. He now lived in a comfortable house with a small backyard, a house that felt more like a home than the gilded palace ever had. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of Leo's laughter, the murmur of the television, and the scent of Alara's cooking wafting from the kitchen. Alara was no longer his cleaning woman. She was a director on the foundation's board, her lived experience and innate compassion an invaluable guide. She had enrolled in night classes to renew her nursing license, her quiet determination and inspiration to everyone she met. She had not sought a single dollar of his fortune for herself. Her only request had been that the foundation be real, that it truly help people. Their relationship had blossomed slowly, organically, like the rescued orchid that now thrived in their sun-filled living room. It was built not on grand romantic gestures, but on 1,000 small moments, on shared cups of tea late at night, on helping Leo with his homework, on planting a vegetable garden together in the spring. They were two broken people who, together, were becoming whole. The culmination of their first year of work was the dedication of the David Jensen house. A small apartment building the foundation had retrofitted to provide transitional housing for families navigating the aftermath of a workplace tragedy. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the air smelling of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Alistair stood before a small crowd of community members, journalists, and the families who would soon call the building home. He spoke not of balance sheets or projections, but of responsibility and second chances. He spoke of David, a man he had never met, but whose legacy of integrity they were all there to honor. As he finished his speech, a local news reporter knelt down to speak to Leo, who was standing beside Alara in the front row. "That man is doing a very nice thing," the reporter said, pointing her microphone toward the boy. "Who is he to you?" Leo, who had been clutching Alistair's hand just moments before, looked at the reporter with his usual serious expression. He didn't hesitate. His voice, clear and bright, carried in the quiet afternoon air. "He's my dad." The words, so simple and so profound, struck Alistair with a beautiful, heart-stopping force. He looked over at Alara and saw the same stunned joy reflected in her tear-filled eyes. It wasn't a legal designation or a formal title. It was a statement of fact, a truth declared from the heart of a child. In that moment, they were no longer just Alistair and Alara and Leo. They were a family. Later that evening, the three of them were sitting on the porch of their home, wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. The excitement of the day had faded, leaving behind a deep and abiding peace. Leo was asleep, his head resting in Alara's lap, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Alistair felt a gentle touch on his face. He turned to see Alara looking at him, her expression filled with a love that felt as real and solid as the ground beneath their feet. Her finger traced the faint, silvery line of a scar on his temple, a relic from a clumsy childhood fall he had told her about one night. He had always hated it, a small imperfection on a life that was supposed to look flawless. She leaned in and pressed her lips to it, a soft, tender kiss that healed more than just the skin. It was a kiss of acceptance, a reverence for his imperfections, for the man he was, not the man he was supposed to be. "This is home," he whispered, the words a quiet prayer of gratitude. Alara smiled, her hand finding his in the cool night air. "We are home," she corrected him gently. He looked at their entwined hands, then at the sleeping boy, and finally at her face, illuminated by the warm glow of the porch light. The sad king in the tower was gone, replaced by a man who had found his sunshine. He had learned that true wealth was not something you owned, but something you built, one small, quiet act of kindness at a time. And together, in the humble warmth of their chosen family, they had built a fortune beyond measure.